Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us and welcome to Anderson House here in Washington, D.C. My name is Andrew Allen and I'm the Historical Programs Manager for the American Revolution Institute of the Society of the Cincinnati. The American Revolution Institute promotes knowledge and appreciation for the achievement of American independence by supporting advanced study, exhibitions, and other historical programs and tours, advocating historic preservation, and providing resources to classrooms that benefit teachers, students, and scholars alike. Since 1938, the Society of the Cincinnati has done this work from right here at its headquarters, Anderson House, a National Historic Landmark, completed in 1905 as the winter residence of Lars and Isabel Anderson. Now, tonight's lecture, a program made possible in part by a generous gift from the Massachusetts Society of the Cincinnati, features historical archaeologist Wade Katz discussing his team's recent discovery of a mass burial at Red Bank Battlefield Park in New Jersey. For nearly a decade, Red Bank Battlefield Park has been the focus of a series of archaeological studies investigating the Hessian attack on Fort Mercer on October 22nd, 1777. During a public archaeology program, a mass burial space was discovered and is thought to contain the remains of Hessian soldiers who lost their lives in that attack. Tonight, we are fortunate to be joined by the lead archaeologist on the study who will discuss how the discovery was made, what was found, and the most recent analyses that have been made so far. Wade Katz is the president and principal of South River Heritage Consulting. He is a historical archaeologist with more than 4 decades of experience with the history, archaeology, historic preservation, and cultural resource management in the Mid-Atlantic region. His military history and archaeology experience includes projects throughout the eastern United States, including works at battlefields and fortifications in Delaware, Kentucky, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, Vermont, Virginia, and Tennessee. Many of these projects were focused on Revolutionary War sites and battlefields and include studies at Brandywine, Bennington, Couch's Bridge, the Battle of the Hook, Hubbardton, Princeton, Red Bank, Short Hills, and Stone Arabia. Mr. Katz is also a recipient of the Archaeological Society of Delaware's Archibald Fraser Award for distinguished achievement in and contributions to archaeology, and that was given to him in 2016, and the National Society Daughters of the American Revolution History Award Medal for contributions to Delaware and National History and Archaeology, awarded in 2021. Now, without further delay, please join me in welcoming to Anderson House my friend Wade Katz.
Thank you, Andrew, and thanks for having me this evening, and thanks for coming out tonight. I will be speaking about this project that we just did in Red Bank, New Jersey, and I'll talk a little bit about where that is located. And so those of you who may not be from the Mid-Atlantic or from the Delaware River Valley, this will kind of orient you to where you are. This was a project, as Andrew indicated, that was initially a public archaeology program. The intent to uncover human remains was not something that was intended. So this was sort of once that happened, it kind of changed the direction of the project, but it's been a very, very interesting and very successful project. And so what you'll be hearing tonight is kind of where we are in the project right now. There will be a lot more that happens over the coming months, coming years. The project was funded by the New Jersey Heritage Historical Commission and by Gloucester County, New Jersey. And I want to warn you, those of you who may be offended by imagery of skeletal remains, there will be some photographs of skeletal remains here. This is not the intent. I'm trying to do this from a scientific background and a historical background. When we had a lot of press coverage of this project in the summertime, I was very concerned that if we put any imagery at all of human remains in a newspaper, that's all anybody would see and not understand what the entire project was. We were very careful throughout that project, and as we continue during the project, to be respectful of the human remains and who these individuals were, and to treat them with dignity at all times. And so we're being as respectful and careful about that as we possibly can be. The project team, while you're looking at me, and I'm the principal archaeologist involved in the project, right now the project team is quite large and is growing as we go. So the other people that I should acknowledge here are Jen Janofsky, who is the project. She's the professor of public history at Rowan University in Gloucester. In Glassboro, New Jersey. She's also the director of the Red Bank Battlefield Park and my co-director on this project. I was joined also by archaeologist Dana Link, who is a professional archaeologist, Anna Delaney from the New Jersey State Police Forensic Anthropology Lab, Stuart Alexander, who is a forensic dentist, has his own practice, but also works for the forensics for the state police. David Orr is a retired National Park Service archaeologist, professional archaeologist, and my mentor, somebody that was involved with this work as well. Tom Christ is probably the preeminent forensic anthropologist in the country, and he'll be working on this project as well. We had Westchester University students involved, and so I have an adjunct position at Westchester University, so I had some of my students involved, and Heather Holy was there as one of the faculty. Two of my students are identified there, Jessica Miller and Joanna Maurer, and then we also had a number of other volunteer archaeologists from New Jersey who assisted in the project, Richard Veit, Barb Silber, Ian Burrow, and Drew Stanzeski. So we had a lot of professional involvement in the project. While it was a public program, it was very much handled by professional archaeologists who knew what they were doing when they were working on the human remains. But we couldn't have done what we did without the tremendous support of avocational archaeologists and the public. So literally hundreds of hours of time were contributed to this project in order for this to be accomplished. If you saw it in the press, just kind of gives you a sense of what we learned or how this got out. Rowan University handled the press, and when that happened, they kept track of the press. And so you can get a sense of where this story has gone. It seems to have legs and kind of carry it around not only the country, but internationally. And so it's published in Germany, the UK, Netherlands, Spain, France, India, Vietnam, Indonesia, and New Zealand. Don't ask me why that combination of particular countries, but that seems the place that it was picked up. Domestically, 46 states in the United States. National TV was over 600,000 people that watched various news elements of this. I'm just amazed when you see the national radio audience of 1.6 million people and those kind of things. So it's a project that there's a lot of interest that's been generated. So I'll give you a little bit of background about Red Bank Battlefield Park. It is a county park in Gloucester County, New Jersey. It's maintained by the county. It's located along the Delaware River, across the river from the Philadelphia airport. So any of you who have ever perhaps landed in Philadelphia, when you fly in, if you're sitting on the left-hand side of the plane and you look out across the river, you are looking at Fort Mercer or Red Bank Battlefield. You're also flying in right over top of Fort Mifflin. And so again, if you look at the left-hand side of the plane and straight down, you're actually looking at the fortification that was the sort of the sister fort to Fort Mercer. Fort Mercer was on the New Jersey side of the river. Fort Mifflin was on the Pennsylvania side of the river. They get about 200,000 visitors a year to the park right now. The park is used as recreational trail use. It has the remains of Fort Mercer, which is what I'll be speaking about, a Revolutionary War fortification, and also the 1748 James and Ann Whittle House. And this was a Quaker household. So there are a number of kind of competing stories that can be told at this site, one of which is you have a military fortification and a major battle that occur, and you're a Quaker family that this happens on your land, and what's the, kind of what are the storylines that go with that. The battle there's a early 20th century monument, 1906 monument that commemorates the battle. There was an earlier monument erected in 1829, which is probably within the top maybe half dozen monuments that were put up in the United States to recognize the valor and the activities of Revolutionary War generation. This monument is much later. This is the 1906 monument, but this one is sitting in the footprint of the fort itself. The fort was an earthen fortification. It was not solid masonry walls. It was a dug ditch and a dug earthen wall. And I'll talk a little bit about that as I go. To orient you a little bit to the Philadelphia campaign, if you're not familiar with it, you're on the Delaware River. You see circled there is the location of Fort Mercer. Philadelphia is here. The river goes past Delaware and up into this space. Fort Mifflin was on one side of the river. Fort Mercer was on the other. There was a Pennsylvania Navy that was protecting the river. There was also a series of river obstructions that had been put into the river by the Patriot forces. So this was a major issue to have to open the river up. You can see the campaign, the Philadelphia campaign, beginning on the 25th of August. The Crown forces land at the head of the Chesapeake Bay, and over the period of time from the 25th of August to the 26th of September, they maneuver across this area of Delaware and southeastern Pennsylvania to eventually capture Philadelphia on the 26th of September. In between there, you have the Battle of Couch's Bridge on the 3rd of September. You have the Battle of Brandywine on the 11th of September, a near battle on the 16th of September called the Battle of the Clouds, which doesn't happen because a major nor'easter storm blows in and kind of literally the game is called on account of rain. They kind of split both armies and they both split away from each other. Then you have an engagement at Paoli. So the massacre at Paoli is 20th and 21st of September, capture of Philadelphia. But then just because the Crown forces have taken Philadelphia, they have to open the Delaware River up or they will have no supply line. So you need the Royal Navy in order to come in and supply the soldiers that are in the city. So that leads to the Battle of Germantown on the 10th or the 4th of October. And then you see a series of those at the end. Red Bank, which is what I'm talking about today, is on the 22nd of October. You have the following day, one of the greatest naval catastrophes of the Royal Navy is the explosion of the HMS Augusta, right at the same spot where Fort Mercer is located. 64-gun frigate that explodes and burns to the waterline and is kind of an embarrassment for the Royal Navy that you lose a vessel of that size. And then the siege of Fort Mifflin is throughout the month of November. So we're kind of at the end of that whole, if you think about the seasons right now, we're near the end of what all that campaigning season was at this point. So what I'll be talking about in particular is the 22nd of October or thereabouts and the events that happened on that at that time. As Fort Mercer, if you're kind of coming in a little closer, you can get a sense of where the city of Philadelphia. There's a period map that shows Philadelphia and the location of Fort Mercer and Fort Mifflin down here below the river. So you had a distance to travel, several miles by water. This is one of the several images that we have of the fort and what the various engineers felt that it looked like. There have been a number of these maps that were done. There are at least 4 to 6 of these. None of them show the fort exactly the same, any of them. And so from an archaeological standpoint, that is one of the things you want to try to understand. Which of these maps is more accurate than the others? Which is telling me the truth? Which one isn't? So part of the projects and the things that we've been doing over the years is to look at the mapping that was done here. And now just to get you from 1777, I'll bring you up to 2022, and you can get a sense of where Fort Mercer is located here, what is now the city of Philadelphia and the suburbs around it. And this is all very much suburban development. You have the city of Camden, and you had all the 19th and 20th century shipbuilding and industry that was along the Camden waterfront. The American force that defended Fort Mercer was under the command of Christopher Greene. He was a colonel from Rhode Island. It was a Rhode Island force that principally made up the defense force that was there. There were 2 Rhode Island regiments, the 1st and 2nd Rhode Island. It's likely that there were some elements of the 6th Virginia in the fort at the time and also an artillery detachment. It had about 14 guns and about 600 men that were defending the fort. What's important about this defense force, just kind of as an aside, is that there was an African-American component in those Rhode Island regiments. And this is very significant in that this is not the same Rhode Island regiment that you'll hear about that goes to Yorktown or that you're hearing about in later years of the war. This is 1776, 1777. There were enlisted African-Americans and Native Americans in the Rhode Island regiment, in both of those Rhode Island regiments. So they fought at Red Bank, and into the 19th century, you will hear discussions about the African-American community throughout the country was using the battlefield at Red Bank to say, we have just as much legitimacy to be Americans because we fought for your country, fought for our country, just like you all did. Red Bank is an example of that. So I just bring that to your attention because that is there over the years that actually was debated and in times completely dropped out of the discussion. So it's important to, I think, keep that in the discussion. The force that opposed them or that attacked the fort was under the command of the man that you see shown there, Emil Karl von Donop. He was in command of a Hessian Grenadier Brigade. It was a reinforced brigade. The Grenadier Battalion, there were 3 Grenadier Battalions in the unit, the von Linsing Battalion, the von Minigerode Battalion, and the von Lengerke Battalion. Those are named after their commanding officers. The ones that you see bolded there are the 3 battalions that actually participate in the attack. So the assault force is a total combined brigade of about 2,400 men. It's more like 1,400 men that actually take place in the attack itself. The Hessian Field Jaeger Corps, for example, and a small Royal Artillery attachment, they're involved, but they are not directly involved in the assault on the fort. So it's really, and in particular, what I'll be talking about, you should think about them as the Minigerode Battalion and the von Mirbach Battalion. The von Mirbach Battalion was a Fusilier or Musketeer regiment, not a Grenadier Battalion. And I'll talk about that distinction in a little bit. In brief, the attack is an assault on the fort late on the day of October 22nd. Von Donop had called the garrison to surrender formally. He came and asked them to surrender. If you do not surrender, you will have no quarter. We will kill everybody that's in the fort. Christopher Greene basically gave the kind of response that I think we hear from General McAuliffe at Bastogne, which is basically nuts. Go ahead, come on, we're ready for you. In between the time that Greene had shown up with the Rhode Island forces, you see this drawing shows a wall here. This became the defense corps space that Greene protected. This is the size of the fort, but that size of that fort was way too large for the garrison that he had. And so with that size of force that he had, he built a new wall on the inside of the fort that the Hessian forces had no knowledge of. And so when they start the assault, the Mirbach Regiment attacks the center of the fort. The Linsing Battalion attacks the points in the south end, and the Minigerode Battalion attacks this side. These 2 battalions go right over the outside wall of the fort. There's nobody stopping them because the American garrison has pulled back in. And so the Hessian forces, as they cross the wall, are thinking they've already won the battle, they've taken the site, and they've won. They get inside this space, and the Pennsylvania naval vessels seated here and the garrison here, this became a killing zone, which was extremely deadly. And after about 45 minutes, the Hessian forces withdrew with extensive casualties. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 24 to 28% of the assault force were casualties, which is unheard of in the 18th century. That's a pretty high casualty rate for almost any Revolutionary War battle. If you look at it on another period map, this was done by one of the French engineers who came there later. You can see where the Minigerode Battalion attacks the north end, Mirbach attacks the center, and the von Linsing Battalion attacks the southern end. No one ever got into the citadel, the defense space that was identified as the citadel. Now, to orient you to the archaeology that we did, there, that red mark is the approximate location of where our excavations occurred. So you can see that we're at the northern end of the fort in that section that was the abandoned portion, and it's where the Mirbach Battalion and probably Minigerode forces both kind of crossed. American casualties were extremely light, 14 dead, 21 wounded. So extremely low compared to what the Hessian forces took. If you look at a statement that came from Samuel Ward, who was one of the majors at the time inside the fort and sent immediately a letter to Washington, you see that he indicates that the enemy lost a lieutenant colonel, 3 captains, 4 lieutenants, 70 rank and file killed, Count von Donop, the commanding officer, mortally wounded, a brigade major, captain, lieutenant, and upwards of 70 non-commissioned officers and privates wounded and taken prisoner. That's an extremely high casualty rate. The title of my paper is actually one that one of the other officers makes that comment that I've never left a battlefield in such sorrow of so many of my friends. He indicates that something like 5 to 8 of his friends he just lost in this fight. These are people that he was very close to. He even lost a cousin who also died. So the casualty rate at this battle is really high, and the Hessian accounts are very poignant when you look at them and their descriptions. In some cases, what you're reading is what we would now diagnose as PTSD, but in the 18th century, they didn't recognize it as such. So the treatment of the dead, what do we know about what happened at this battle after it occurred? The first statement we have is from the commanding officer of the 2nd Rhode Island Regiment, where he says the day following, it was not the day of the battle. Remember, it happened at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It's dark by the time it finishes at late 4:45 to 5 o'clock. It's dark. So they wait until the next day to begin burying the dead. This day was spent the greatest part in bringing in the slain, burying them, taking proper care of the wounded. Another diary of Sergeant John Smith of the 1st Rhode Island. In the morning, we began to strip and bury the dead. We buried 75 Hessians in one grave in the entrenchment and covered them over, and 8 or 10 more below the bank by the river. It took us all day to bury the dead. A third account, the fore part of the day, employing ourselves in burying the dead, 73 in one grave, 4 or 5 in another. That's Jeremiah Greene. I saw another man who was a first-person account. I saw men lying naked on the ground except in the part covered with a little straw, and some of them with their limbs off, having died of their wounds. Another firm reminiscent of the battle, upon the embankment of the fort, lay naked and torn by grape shot, 8 or 10 Hessian officers wounded in the back, their long hair reaching to their waist, with large whiskers and mustaches. They were placed there preparatory to burial. Another New Jersey militiaman pension, we buried them in the trenches. And another marched down there a day or two after, and this man helped to haul dirt to bury them in the trenches. So the story is that they buried the Hessian dead in the entrenchment of the fort itself. And you can see from these 2 period maps, the one on the right was actually drawn by Johann Ewald, circa 1777-78. And you see the identification he has there is that in English, it's graves of the officers, more than one officer, who have been shot dead. He uses the plural of officer here to explain where that is located. And another drawn later, 1840s, you can clearly see where the soldiers' graves are situated here beyond that footprint of where that main portion of the fort. Our excavation area is up in here, and on this map, it would be over in here. Any time that bodies were ever identified, they were not in the area where we did the archaeology. Kind of underscores the idea that archaeology is a useful thing to do every now and then to prove or disprove the historical record, because here the historical record was mute on where the bodies were buried. Now think a little bit about the treatment of the dead in the 18th century. What did that entail? And this is something that my colleague, Robert Seelig, and I worked on, and I think he's been a speaker here before at times, so it's nice to be able to follow in his footsteps. These are some of the points that we developed as we looked at the 18th century burials and what you could see on a battlefield. And this is distinctive from a hospital, and these are battlefield burials. So you'll find that they're carried out, obviously, by whoever is the force that occupies the ground. If there isn't a force on the ground, sometimes it has to be the civilians who will finish the burial episodes. The season of the year will depend, the location of the engagement, how isolated is the space, how populated is the area. What is really important to keep in mind on this one are these, particularly down at the bottom, they are quick and expedient burials. Ditches, wells, pits, ponds along the road, other pre-existing holes in the ground, that's where bodies will be placed. They are not being buried in any kind of a sanctified manner or any kind of consecrated ground. You are trying to get them into the ground as quickly as possible. The graves will often be shallow. You'll often have multiple burial sites on the battlefield, and also bodies are generally stripped of any clothing, weapons, or accoutrements. Anything that's usable is taken off of that body. So keep all that in mind as I talk about what we found in the bottom of this ditch. So now I'll talk a little bit about the area we were. We'll come forward now 240 some years to what this area looks like now. You see here a topographic map. The town that we were working in is actually called National Park, New Jersey. So it's kind of a misnomer because there is no national park there, but it still is called National Park. There's a whole sidebar conversation I could have about why that is, but I won't do that. The site location is up at the far end of what this area here is the park itself. This is new land that the county had just acquired. It's only about a 1/4 acre lot, but it contained a portion of the old fort ditch that you could tell had never been disturbed. And so this was the reason that we went in to test and see what was still present in that old fort ditch. The location a little closer, this is the old boundary line of the park that you see here in green. The new boundary line now includes this space. So the fence that is there now actually follows this line and then actually juts out and picks up this area. So the area we were looking at was right in here. This walking path follows the edge of the fort ditch as it exists in the park today. So if you go to the park today, you will see the topography and it will look like an earthen embankment ditch. That ditch was enhanced in the 1930s by one of the Works Progress Administration's organizations. And so they didn't do that in this section, but they did do that in the section that's in the park. So again, if you put it on another one of the period maps, the general area we're looking at is here very close to where one of the gates into the fort was located. If you look at it on a modern image today, you can see this fence is the fence that separated the formal part of the fort of the park, which is behind the fence or in the distance to the area that we were working in. You see this is the footprint of the ditch. And where these people are standing, that is much more shallow. So it has never been excavated. It's flattened out, but it's still intact. And so we did metal detection in the spring in preparation for the archaeology. And then we did some ground penetrating radar in this area too, which showed us that there were potential anomalies in the bottom of the ditch. But my thinking at that time was the anomalies are related to the garrison. They are going to be the materials when the garrison fled that space. They dumped things into the ditch. This is kind of natural material that would have been part of the occupation of this site. The archaeology, as we did it over a series of days, consisted really of intending to sample the ditch. Again, you can see the curvature of the ditch here. I think we were doing a series of excavation units across that space. Not intended to be a major excavation, intended to be a sampling technique where you just get a sense of what's in the ditch so the county can understand if they want to do something on this parcel, what do they have? Maybe they would want to do more archaeology, maybe they want to put in walking trails or something, but they'd have some idea of what was on the property. As we did more work and we found that there were actually human remains in the ditch, the first excavation unit we did was this one that came down deep enough to hit the ditch, the soils that were in the bottom of the fort ditch. The soils were about 6 to 8 inches of the bottom of the ditch. That contained the 18th century artifacts that are related to the battle and related to the fort. Everything above that, 4.5 feet, roughly 4 to 4.5 feet, is all newer material. Now, remember too that this fort was an earthen embanked wall. So where the photographer is standing, you're almost on the top of the wall. If the wall was still there, looking down into the ditch and across. The outside of the fort and outside would be to the top of the slide. Inside would be behind you. All of that dirt that creates that wall has to go somewhere. So once you're no longer operating the fort, you allow the dirt walls to slump back into the ditch. But so much dirt taken out of a ditch can't ever go back in the ditch exactly the way it came out. So that's why the footprint of that ditch was always visible. It always settled out because it never went back into the ground the same way. I'll have some other images of that you'll be able to see. This is after we had identified the femurs. There were a group of femurs that were found in this excavation unit. We then concluded that we would basically open up a space that was 30 feet long and 10 feet wide. Each of these squares is a 5 foot by 5 foot square. We had a pair of them and we were going to open up enough space to get a good view of what was inside the ditch. When you look at that from the other end, so now you're looking down the line of the 10-foot wide space, 30 feet long. This would have been inside the fort where this gentleman is standing. In a plan view, you can see the excavation units are here. This space is the interior scarp wall of the fort. I'll talk a little bit more about that. The exterior scarp wall, or the counter scarp, is here, which is right down in about this space here. And everything inside this, from here to here, that's the bottom of the ditch. The bottom of the ditch was about 13 feet wide. And as I said, 6 to 8 inches of soil that was in the base. And to get you kind of oriented to what you'll be seeing, every one of the red marks here are locations where we had crania or skulls. So total, there are 15 there right now. So we are dealing with what we think is a population. Our population is 15 minimum individuals. I say we think because in at least one case, there was a second individual in with the first individual. And so it turned out instead of 14, we had 15. Now I'll talk a little bit about the fort itself. The fort was built by a Colonel John Bull, who was a Pennsylvania militia officer. And I find this quote from Ducoudray, who was one of the French engineers who came over. Just the piece that I bolded here. I mean, this is like being damned with faint praise. You know, he loved the fort. He said the fort was too big. It wasn't really a problem. Unlike some of the other forts in the area, it's, you know, conceived and directed and executed. It's okay. But he kind of used only natural good sense, unenlightened by theory. That it kind of implies that he had no idea what he was doing, but he seems to have done an okay job after all. But so this map actually gives you a good understanding of what that fortification looked like. And again, our excavation area is probably in this space. Overall, this fort is nearly 350 yards in length. It was huge. And what has happened over time is that the riverbank has eroded back. And so much of the river has taken off this portion of the fort. About 120 feet of shoreline has eroded away. So much of that core section of the fort, it's not even around anymore and you can't do anything with it. The fort, as you can see in the profile sketches here of Fort Mercer, would have looked something like this. You would have had the frays that were jammed into the outer side of the wall. You see the wall at Yorktown as kind of an example. This is Redoubt 9. There were at least an interior, exterior ditches. You have a earthen embankment wall, a small step, and a very deep ditch. All the dirt that would have been in this ditch is used to make that wall. So if you were in the bottom of this ditch and it's a 8-foot deep ditch, the wall is 8 feet above where you're standing. So it's 16 feet from the bottom of the ditch to the top. That makes for a very difficult climb if you make it that far and you're assaulting the fortification. We have a couple different engineer sketches that show this. This is one, the German sketch that you see here. This is another that was done by an Englishman who shows 2 different sets of ditches and walls because he's illustrating that interior wall as well as an exterior wall, that new wall that was built by the garrison just before the battle. So if you look at it as in profile, the earthen profile that we have, you're looking at what's part of the Scarp Wall. You can see it very clearly, and you see that little terrace, and the fortification wall would have gone up off this side here. This is the bottom of the ditch. This Scarp Wall, as you excavated this, was very, very easy to hit. Once you hit it, it's solid. It was a very different soil texture than anything else around it. So we didn't create that slope. That's the slope that was part of the fort. That's the way it actually looked. We'll talk a little bit about the losses and the skeletal remains that we began to find. So you have a statement like this from Lieutenant Colonel von Wurm, who was there. He didn't actually partake in the event, but he was part of the retreat and he was there. It's painful for me to lose so many good people, he says, but you see the killed and wounded, and the numbers vary. They will always vary in 18th century. They're not very good at giving us really solid dates or solid numbers on a lot of these things. But you get a good sense that it ranges anywhere from 350 men to almost 400. And so I think the number of about 370, 377 is the number that most people have generally settled upon. But that gives you about 24 to 28% of the assault force that was injured or killed. And we have a statement from Johannevald where he actually gives statements about the kinds of wounds he was seeing. And these are important to read, because when you read these on a page, it's one thing. But when you are excavating what you just read on the page, it's very different. And so he indicates the right leg is shot apart, both legs shot to pieces, shot through both legs, shot through the chest and right arm, through the leg, in the arm, right arm shot off, through the left leg, through the neck and head, left foot smashed, right leg shot to pieces, right knee smashed, shot in the left knee. That's pretty graphic description of what's going on. And again, when you're reading it on a piece of paper, it's different than actually seeing it in the ground or seeing the actual physical evidence. Now, what could cause that kind of damage? The Pennsylvania Navy vessels that were here, you see the armament that they carry. They are 18-pound guns all the way up to 132-pound gun. They are firing heavy ordnance into this assault. So not only do you have the garrison firing muskets and smaller cannon artillery, these are heavier guns that are being fired in as well. We have access to a powder horn of a Rhode Island regimental soldier, John Burlingame, who was actually at Red Bank. This was on display at the Museum of the American Revolution not too long ago, and it's only gone back to its owner. It's a privately owned piece. But this illustration actually graphically shows what I just read to you and what we began to see in the bottom of this ditch. So you can see here, this is a headless body. You have missing legs, arms, damaged heads. You see another image of the same thing. You get the same kinds of damage illustrations. It's a very primitive drawing on a powder horn, but it's very graphic of what it was that Ewald's description is. And the more this came to our attention after we were already in the ditch, and you go like, I'm not sure that I had to dig anybody up in the ditch because this illustrates it very, very clearly. The kind of damage that could be caused by is chain shot and bar shot. And at least one of the Hessian officers, you can see here, says 2 ships which could not be seen fired chain shot into the right flank. The latter knocked down whole rows of men. Chain shot is used in naval vessels for taking down masts and rigging. It's also extremely useful as an anti-personnel weapon in taking off legs, arms, and heads. We have 15 individuals in the bottom of that trench, and we define them based on heads. You only all have one head, and that's why we have 15 in the bottom. Many of the bodies that we have, many of the skeletal remains we have, don't have full skeletons. All we have are parts. So that description here, the description that Ewald uses and the powder horn description are very accurate to what it is that we're seeing in the base of that trench. I showed you earlier where the red stars or the red dots illustrated. This gives you a much closer view of this, what we had. The base of the trench is between the red lines. So this is that space that's about 13 feet across. This is the Scarp Wall. This is the top of the Scarp Wall. So this young woman is right at the top of the crest of that wall. You can clearly see the later filling of the ditch. You see it here. And this soil is all part of the fort wall when it pushed back in or it washed back into the ditch itself. The soil that contained the human remains and the artifacts is down in about this bottom 8 inches of soil here. Every one of these yellow stars illustrates the location of one of the crania that we identified. And this gives you a rough idea of what some of those excavation areas looked like. currently each of these individuals or each of these is numbered. And so the one you see in the center here is number 7. Number 7 is probably the most complete of the human remains that we have. He's face down along that Scarp Wall and laying on his left arm. He had been hit by a musket ball in his lower right back. He was laying on his left arm with an iron grape shot lodged in his left arm, and he had a lead canister shot in the middle of his back. You can see his thoracic vertebra come down and then stop. It's possible that one or more of those wounds removed whatever was part of his spinal column, and that's why it's not there. We had long bones. You can see leg bones and leg bones here. As I said, most of what we had were crania, skulls, not a lot. I mean, we have a lot of long bones, but we don't have full torsos. We don't have full skeletal sets of skeleton. Sometimes when we were doing this, and actually very helpful, what we did is that as you excavated down, we would be doing metal detecting in the excavation area itself. Battlefield sites are best found with the metal that they leave behind, lead shot, buckles, buttons, those kinds of things. That was very, very helpful when we did this, because as you were excavating the base of the trench, we would come across bone, and then we would start coming across musket balls in association with that. And in fact, you can see some of the artifacts that we identified as we went down. Interestingly, only about 100 artifacts are really coming from the bottom of that ditch in that 6 to 8 inches of soil. And they consist mostly of buttons, buckles, munitions, and that's about it. So as I earlier indicated, you strip the body of anything that's valuable or that you could use. We were not finding lots of buttons, and then we would hit clusters of buttons. And so you see in the lower left image, one of the lines of buttons that we actually had. These are all buttons in association with a skeletal remains. Another repoussé button that was here, and a button closer, a clothing hook here. We have some fragments of fabric or leather that are preserved in association with the buttons. I think in the case of the buttons, they represent a coat or more than one coat, but not in association with a skeleton. They're being used to carry those human remain parts and throw them in the bottom of the ditch. So they're coming out in tight clusters. We'll have 25 buttons in one space, but not laid out. This was unusual to see them this way. Most of the time they were kind of just clustered together. Our pewter buttons we recovered don't even register as metal anymore. They have deteriorated to the point where they're not even being seen that way. So we would find them as we were excavating, but you couldn't see them any other way. That leads me to the buttons of we're trying to decide who they may be. You see the soldiers on the left are the Grenadier Battalion, and that is actually made up of 4 separate grenadier companies, and they were drawn similar to the way that the British forces created a Grenadier Battalion or a light infantry battalion. They do the same thing for the Hessian forces. And so these were the companies from the Hereditary Prince Regiment, the Ditforth Regiment, the Losberg Regiment, and the Kniphausen Regiment. Each of those, you can tell, wears a different color facings to their jackets. Their helmets are different. To their left is the Mirbach Regiment, which was a Fusilier Regiment. The archaeology that we have done at the park in the past has recovered large, kind of flat buttons, probably associated with one of the Grenadier battalions. But the buttons we found this time are almost exclusively these types of buttons. And so you see on the left, it's a brass button with a slight kind of indent or incising around the outside. Here's a good example of a currently existing button off of a regimental coat like this. This coat is from Frederick the Great's army, 1786. Our buttons look nearly identical to what those are. That's a Fusilier regimental coat, not a Grenadier's coat. So one of the things we're going to be trying to look at is, can we understand whose buttons do these belong to? Now, there's all kinds of issues here, like where are these human remains coming from on the battlefield to reach the section of the ditch that we looked at? but we're going to be working on that as well. Weaponry, we recovered 19 impacted musket balls. All of those impacted or fired musket balls are from the size caliber of a Charleville musket. So they represent the firing of the American garrison, those Rhode Island defenders. Those are musket balls being fired by the Rhode Island defenders. One musket ball we found was an unfired musket ball, round and hadn't hit anything. It was still round, had a little bit of black residue on the outside of it. It is a German caliber ball and probably represents one of the German soldiers who was carrying a pouch of some kind in his pocket or with him, and it got thrown into the ditch. We have a couple iron grape shot, a lead canister shot, 2 gun flints, and one gun screw off of a weapon of some kind. I mentioned earlier, we have some places where the musket balls are in direct association with the human remains. You can see them here. These are in association with a couple of the long bones. The grape shot, we only have 2 within the space that we excavated, but literally over the centuries, thousands of grape shot have been found at Red Bank Battlefield. This is just one box of the grape shot that has been found there. So that's a 1-inch iron ball that is being fired either by the fortification, the guns in the fort, or by the naval vessels that are firing in. And you fire them in a pouch so that they come out as either 6 or 9 iron grape shot at the same time. It's sort of a shotgun effect that you use. I mentioned the artifact cluster, the grouping, that included 2 of the gun flints, that repoussé button, and the musket ball, which we think might be, has gunpowder, which will be tested for gunpowder. We did some blood residue analysis on the artifacts early on, and that actually we tested a couple of the musket balls, and we tested one of the grape shot, and we tested one of the knee buckles, and the knee buckle tested positive for blood. We used what's called the KM test, the Kasselmeyer test, which is a presumptive test, just means that it tests positive. It's possible that the brass of the buckle, as that metal deteriorates, it's giving us a false positive for blood, but it's also possible that there really could be blood residue on these. So as I indicated, maybe it didn't, the human remains right now are with the state police, the New Jersey State Police Forensic Lab. Safest, most secure place you could have them. They will help us do some of these tests. And so the blood residue analysis, we'll be looking at all of the musket balls. We only had sampled a small number at first. The other knee buckle, a couple of the buttons, we're going to just try to see if anything else tests positive that we can find. And the purpose of testing positive is that you can possibly extract DNA from blood residue. And so one of the hopes that we'll be able to do here is begin to identify who these individuals were. You may have heard that we recovered a coin at this site as well. This was a King George III gold guinea. Now, I've been involved in archaeological projects for nearly 40 years as a professional archaeologist, and I've never found gold like that before. It was pretty remarkable. So that was like during the public event, public day, and one of our public participants, she found it in the screen and was very excited about what she had. She should be. It's worth more than a 1 month's wage for the average Hessian soldier. So it's not likely to be a piece that is being carried by just your average Hessian private. Could be an officer, therefore, who has it. It's been suggested that it was hidden in his coat. Maybe it's one of these coats that was used to pick up and dump things. Maybe it was in his boot. Someone has suggested it could have been a keepsake and that this was a talisman of some kind that you keep. Good luck piece. In doing research on the Brandywine battlefield, I came across this statement, which I think is really interesting because it needs some kind of anthropological processing and see if it really exists. You see here that John Fanning Watson was an early chronicler of the history of the Philadelphia region. And he goes out to the Brandywine battlefield, which is, 30 miles out from the city. And he goes to where the Birmingham Meeting House is, which is where the main core of the battle was. And he notes that if you're there, and he's writing this, by the way, in 1832, if you meet the grave digger, you may see him dig up the bones of some British soldier at only 2 feet under the ground, or, as I bolded there, You may even be shown some old gold coin found concealed once in the great queue of a buried Hessian. So the queue is that long braid that the Hessian soldiers have. You'll remember earlier on, one of those statements was we saw them laid out and they had their hair braided. We have 15 skulls in the bottom of that trench. Is that what we have, one of these coins that's braided in? I need more information on that statement. Where does John Fanning Watson come up with a statement like that? And is that a folk tradition? What do we know about that? So before I think that's the best answer, I want to have more evidence for it. But I find it as another one of those possible lines of evidence that you could look at. We also did a number of different things here, including portable X-ray machines in the field itself to see what you could see. And so you see some of the imagery on the left-hand side of the mandibles as we were looking at them and the teeth. So what do we know so far? And keep in mind that this is preliminary and subject to change as we do more analyses. We are looking at a minimum number of 15 individuals. Right now, they are all male, young to early middle age adults. There's evidence that all of these are European descent, or put another way, none of these appear to be Native American or African American based on what we can see. Bone preservation, and you can see on the right-hand side of one of the set of long bones, is very poor, fair to poor. And so the kinds of things that sometimes you can get from human remains from bone, we might not be able to see that here, but we'll get as much out of this as we possibly can. A number of the individuals have well-preserved teeth, which might provide us with a lot of the soil, the chemical sampling that we can do that helps us kind of learn more about this population. And lastly, there doesn't appear to be any evidence of perimortem or trauma or postmortem mutilation. So, you know, perimortem at or near the time of death, postmortem after death. So we're not seeing, one of the things that somebody suggested was that we were looking at perhaps a hospital and these were amputations. Well, most time people don't amputate your head and put you into the hole. So that would be not likely to be the case. Even though there were hospitals on the site, that's not what we're looking at here. So our next steps and the things that we've been doing, we're X-raying and doing CT scans of all the human remains. We'll try to do mitochondrial DNA, which we could do off of teeth and cortical bone. The cortical bone has to come out of your long bones, your heavier bones. And right now that doesn't look like we'll have much success with that. Most of these are so deteriorated that there's not much structure left in the core. And even in the case of some of the teeth, there's no structure left in the teeth either. So we'll have to be kind of judicious about that. We will do stable isotope analysis, which will help us with diet and with location of where these soldiers were born and where they came from. And there are a number of other samples in the country right now that are being found. They've found some recently on Camden Battlefield that we can add to or can kind of compare our work to. There's been human remains recovered at Lake George, in New York. That's a population that would be similar to this Revolutionary War. A few that were found up in Ridgefield, Connecticut, also battlefield related, that could be part of this. So there are a number of potential studies that we could be doing here, that kind of comparative studies will be really valuable to look at. We'll look at, as I mentioned, some of the blood residue analyses we'll try to identify pathologies, sex, age, stature, the things that you normally do with a skeletal population. Artifact processing is ongoing. We're going to have to be doing artifact conservation because these are artifacts that almost certainly will be put back on display at some point. So we're going to have to be doing a level of conservation on these. And then a lot of the historical research, the military research, genealogical, land use history of the area. The Hetrina is a document that was developed for the Hessian forces that we're going to try to look at as well. And then ultimately, these bodies will be reinterred in some location. I'm going to leave you with this statement, which I think is really interesting, this poem. This is from Parson Weems, which in his Life of Washington, he writes this about Red Bank Battlefield in 1809. So it's one of those battles that is sort of like drifted off of our knowledge, and yet in 1809, he clearly recognized this as a significant location. And I see this as a kind of a statement to the human remains that we have found. Heaps on heaps, the slaughtered Hessians lie. Brave Greene beholds them with a tearful eye. far now from home and from their native shore. They sleep in death and hear of war no more. So with that, I will stop. And if there are any questions, I'll be glad to try to take them. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you for a great presentation. It is possible that the successful American performance at the Battle of Red Bank was an act of revenge or retribution to the British success at the Battle of Brandywine, or Brandywine Creek, as it's sometimes called. In that battle, which took place 40 days earlier, British forces managed to outflank the colonial army, inflicted major losses, which forced General Washington to spend the winter, a miserable winter in Valley Forge, and the British conquered Philadelphia. But a contributing fact to that victory was a Hessian maneuver, a diversionary Hessian maneuver at Shad's Ford under the commander of Lieutenant General Wilhelm von Kniphausen, brilliant commander who managed with the Hessian army to completely outsmart, so to speak, General Washington and make a successful flanking movement, which led to a major loss at Battle of Brandywine.
So I'm familiar with that engagement and what Kniphausen did there. You have at Red Bank, the assault force is von Donop's brigade, which had not been engaged at Brandywine. There seems to have actually been some discussion within the Crown forces, within the British Army, that since the battle at Fort Washington, a year earlier in November of 1776, Hessian forces were not pulling their weight as far as the British felt. So Red Bank was an opportunity for von Donop, because right after Fort Washington, you'll have the Trenton Battle of Trenton, and you lose 900 men who are captured. And then they don't really perform well at Brandywine. They're not like out front and doing what they expected them to do. If you look at the casualty records, they're pretty low for the Hessian forces, the Grenadier units in particular. So von Donop may have taken this on as I need to kind of hold up the Hessian end of things here. He is reportedly offered artillery to take with him, heavier guns, and he says he doesn't need them. We're going to be able to do this ourselves. He calls the garrison to surrender, and a number of his officers actually suggested that that was not a good idea. You should have done a surprise attack, not tell them we're out here, and now they have time to prepare. I think that the bravery of the Hessian forces is certainly not in question at this fight. It's the garrison's defense in that small space that they had to work with, plus the naval vessels, which really make the difference. And I think you see that in what we identified here. I don't think anybody gives the naval vessels their fair support in this. That, having guns of that size firing into your right flank and rear really rips your force apart. So, and von Donop pays for this with his life. He's killed at this battle. The commanding officer of the Mirbach Battalion is killed here. The other, the commander of the Linsing Battalion is wounded here. So the officer corps certainly lives up to their what they were supposed to be doing. It's just that this was not. I don't think it's a response. I don't think Christopher Greene expected this to actually turn out the way it did. He just had been told that you have to hold this post. Do not let anybody take it. And so that's what he did.
Early on, you said you didn't intend to find bodies. So what was the original scope of this project?
So the original scope was, as I said, a public archaeology project, which was going to be sampling the ditch and actually trying to learn something about the fort. How was the fort constructed? So the little bit of time that I spent on that was what we were trying to learn with doing that. The intent really was to get a sense of what's in the ditch. This is not a space that's threatened by any development, by anything that's going to happen. And so this would allow the park as a public space to do ongoing programming if it wanted to. And this would have been one of the places, you know, you can do archaeology projects and engage the public and have them part of the work.
And based on those historical maps, you all thought that the burial site was somewhere else. So you didn't really have
Shouldn't
a
have
hunch?
been.
You didn't really think about that?
No,
Yeah.
shouldn't have been there at all. And there's nobody who has yet indicated that that's where human remains were supposed to be buried.
So I was impressed about the number of teeth in that one skull. Was there any indication of the condition of the teeth? Were they worn down at all?
Some are. We have some. I can remember one who has the pipe smokers. I forget what it's called now, but basically the space where he's worn down his teeth because he held a pipe. Some of the teeth can show us age, for example. When we saw them in the field, one of the sets appeared to be somebody who was probably a late teenager, early 20s, but immediately adjacent to them was somebody who was probably 30 to 40. Another had a carabelly cuspid, which is a very distinctive European tooth indication, and many of you may have them. I forget, it's about 30% of the population that has a little lump on your cuspid that is called a carabelly cuspid. So as we go through these, we'll be looking at more of them. What I didn't show you was as I indicated, the condition of these in general were pretty bad. So we excavated them as a large clump of dirt, if you will. So you had the bone, you knew what you had. We would work our way around and then pack the whole thing up and take it in and then peel the soil away in the lab. So what we're finding is that in some cases, the bone is in such poor condition, you can't take any more soil out from in the center of that or the whole thing will collapse. So I'm sure over the next several months, you're going to be seeing, we'll be seeing other things on these that I haven't been able to report yet. Yes. No, the ditch is not open. We backfilled the ditch soon after we finished the excavations. So the space has been restored to what it looked like. And as I indicated, you saw in one of those images, there was a fence that split the original portion of the park from this 1/4 acre. That fence is now down, and the fence now, a new fence now incorporates the 1/4 acre into the parcel. So it's clearly within the footprint of the park now.
Would there normally have been some kind of record keeping of who the Hessian soldiers were? And is it just that that documentation has been lost with time, or were they somehow considered not significant enough to have had their identities recorded somewhere back home at the beginning?
That's a good question. So there is record of who the Hessian soldiers were. There is a document that was created in the 1970s in the Marburg archive that is called the Hetrina, which is translates to be basically Hessian forces in America. And it's a database that you can identify individuals who served from either Hesse-Kassel or Hesse-Hanau, I think are the two states that they use. So ours would probably be Hesse-Kassel. And you can check them for their name, and it'll give you something about their service record as well. We haven't yet done all that, but that's something that we'll be doing. And as we go through this, as I indicated, we want to do more research into the specifics of the Mirbach Regiment and the Minnigerode Regiment and the Linsing Regiment, even though I don't think we have individuals who are probably from the Linsing based on where we are on the fort wall. And I would like to look at things like where were they born? Where did they come from? Where did they enlist? What was their age? For example, the one that I indicated who's like a late teen, early 20, right now there only appears to be one soldier who even fits that. And so it's possible that that's who we're looking at. I mean, I look at this, that we excavated a site that these soldiers, these men were unceremoniously dumped in the bottom of this ditch. And probably there are few people in Germany that even knew what happened to them. You know, once the soldiers that were with you said, yeah, he was killed at Red Bank, but they don't know where he went. The Hessian forces were not the ones who did the burying. It was the American forces that did the burying. So these are people who disappeared 245 years ago. If we're able to get any connection of who they are with a modern population, I'd be very pleased to be able to do that. I have said on a couple of occasions, if we can help with closure for somebody that didn't even know they needed closure because their ancestor died several generations ago, they made it to North America, but they never knew where they went. So we're trying to treat these as if, I mean, I would like them to get a burial that they should have gotten in 1777 and that wasn't afforded them. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but.
Clarify the nature of the arrangement. The Hessians were mercenaries, but not as individuals. What was the political arrangement that got the Hessians with the British Army? It was not that they were individually mercenaries. Was it whole units? How did that work?
Yeah, so the Hessian forces are actually, the Hessian army at the time in Europe was considered one of the finest armies in Europe. And so you farmed out, you basically rented your army. So you're right, they're not individual soldiers who are coming. They are entire battalions, regiments. I forget what the number is now, but it's 12,000, 13,000 at least that actually served with the British forces. They had also done this in the French and Indian War, and there's evidence of a garrison, a Hessian garrison in England that was a Hessian force on, I think it's Salisbury Plain, that was there for like a year or 2 years and then went back to Germany. But what that does is it freed up British forces to come and fight somewhere else. So you have a very highly qualified force of men who come here to fight. These are professional soldiers. As you had mentioned, Wilhelm von Kniphausen is one of the best, major generals in the British forces. Von Donop was a very, very good commander. Johann Ewald, who I showed you his name a couple times, he will go on to be a Danish lieutenant general in the Danish army when he retires in 1809. He cuts his teeth in the American Revolution. He writes a book in 1785 called Treatise on Partisan Warfare. He's considered to be one of the leaders on how you do partisan warfare, small unit battles and things. I mean, they are very, very highly qualified soldiers. Very good. Now, that's the 1776 contingent is probably better than the 1777, 1778. As the recruits keep coming in, the quality might go down, but they were very qualified soldiers.
Who received the rent payment?
I'm sorry?
Who received the payment?
So the Landgrave of Hesse-Kassel, the leader of the country, that's who he rents the force. That's what he's doing. So in answer to your question about records, it's important to keep records because these are like pieces of a machine, right? So I need to replace, I've lost 5 pieces of my machine. I need to replace them. And you know what their names are and you know who these individuals are. So the records are actually pretty close. The records should be quite good.
We do have a few questions from our online attendees. The first being, are there any records of local inhabitants burying the dead after the Battle of Fort Mercer?
So immediately after the battle, it's the garrison that does the burying, and there are stories well into the 19th and 20th century of human remains being found on the battlefield, and families coming back and bones being identified. As I indicated, about 120 feet of shoreline has eroded away off the Delaware River there, and that is supposedly where that southern burial space was, the one that was illustrated in the 1849 drawing. That's all washed into the Delaware. And if you read some of the accounts, they'll say the last set of bones that we know about washed into the river in 1865, so, but there are also stories of people coming out of Philadelphia and taking the bones and, playing tricks on people with the bones and doing stuff with the bones that were just laying there in the fields. So there, as far as immediately after the battle, I don't think I've seen nothing about civilians that came on the site. That fort is still functioning as a fort into November of 1777, almost late November. So the garrison is there, and the garrison gets reinforced from 600 men to an even larger force than that. If anything, the Whittle family who owned the property doesn't come back to the house for nearly a year after the battle, and their property is completely trashed. So the damages caused by the war are pretty remarkable on their land.
Another question is, and it sounds like we have an educator here or a teacher. If you were speaking to a high school student, what is the biggest point, fact, concept from this discovery that you would tell them?
If I was speaking to a high school student.
Yes, if you were making a lesson out of this. Sounds like somebody's
Wow.
coming up with a lesson plan right now.
Yeah, working on a lesson plan. Let's see. Well, if you want, and there are a couple ways you could do that. To me, it's important to recognize that the contribution that archaeology makes in this story is really, really significant. If we hadn't excavated a space, we wouldn't know that these individuals were here. And in all likelihood, that's not all of them. There are probably more in that ditch. That completely changes how we think about that space. If you go to Red Bank Battlefield today, you can watch the airplanes land at Philadelphia. People walk and do their power walks. Pokemon Go goes on in the space. It's a publicly used space, but nobody is really thinking about what happened here and what this space means. So that's one way to look at it. I think the immediacy of the physical remains is really important. The time depth, if you're living in New Jersey, it's a unique space in New Jersey. And I'm very much a supporter of all history is local history. So if you don't understand your local history, you're not going to understand your national history. That's a place that anybody living in Southern New Jersey should really care about.
Great. And going off of that, what does this discovery do for not only the interpretation of the battle itself, but the Hessians in the war?
So the interpretation of the battle, it's going to change the way we begin to think about how things happen in that park and what you do. I also commented before that at the time we were digging the trench, the ditch, at the far end of the park was the Butterfly Festival. And then at our end of the park was the bullets and bodies and buttons. It's like there's something very incongruous about what's happening in two different locations in the same space. So that will probably alter that in some way as thinking about what you do on the space. It'll certainly help enhance the interpretation of the site. And I think this offers a real opportunity to learn a lot more about the Hessian forces that were in North America using the physical evidence that we've got, as well as the more recent documents and things that are being written, like Frederica Barr's book and the number of studies that are being done now. So with the 250th anniversary coming up, there's a real opportunity to look at the Hessian forces and actually, think about putting a face, literally a face to them. If we're able to do that, which I didn't mention, we will try we'll try to do facial reconstruction on people if we've got a full face to be able to do that. So that really will put a face to who some of these individuals were, and these people will not have just disappeared off the landscape.
Great. And so to backtrack a little bit, you mentioned that these guys were not supposed to be there at all. With that surprise, do you think that there are more burials or mass graves out there on Red Bank Battlefield?
Yes, there are. I would say that there are still, there are probably more. And I can say that just based on the space we excavated. because our GPR signals indicated stuff outside of the excavation area that we were in. So most certainly there are more. And that is what I mean where it changes how you think about what you do there. If all of the bodies had washed into the river, which everybody thought, and they were at that southern end of the park, you can do all kinds of things. But now that you realize that there could very well be more in the bottom of that ditch, it changes the kinds of ways you think about the things that you'll do there. And the fact that it's a burial space. It's a unmarked and unconsecrated cemetery. It's not a cemetery. And we've had some conversations with people where they've said, why are you digging in a cemetery? And you go, that's not a cemetery. This was not identified as such. There are no headstones. There are nothing to even indicate that there were people here at all. So I consider it to be a burial space. It's just an area that these sets of human remains ended up in.
Great. And we will end it on this question. Moving forward, how can our viewers in person and at home stay informed of the continuing finds and research from the project itself?
So the park, the Red Bank Battlefield Park does have a web page and a Facebook page. I'm sure that they will put out announcements of things as they progress. I would think some of the things that I talked about, like the blood residue analyses, the DNA analyses, those are all going to begin happening probably after the first of the year. And so we should begin to get some responses and some things and have some more information to go on.
Great. All right. Well, Wade, I want to thank you very much for coming out and speaking
Thanks for
for us
coming
tonight.
tonight.
One more
Appreciate
round of applause for Wade. I want to thank all of you for attending in person and at home. Thank you for your continued support of our mission, and we will see you next week for our next program, which is an author's talk featuring Andrew Wehrman from the Central Michigan University, discussing his new book, The Contagion of Liberty, the Politics of Smallpox in the American Revolution. So again, thank you all for attending, and we will see you next time. Get home safe.